I speak these words knowing they will never reach anyone who can understand them. My name is Navigator Apprentice Selene Morda. Or at least it was before the Eternal Meridian emerged from the warp storm that swallowed us 17 years ago by ship time, 143 years by imperial reckoning as we later discovered. I am recording this testimony not for redemption or warning, but because documentation is the final reflex of a mind trained to observe and catalogue, even when observation reveals truths that unmake understanding. The Inquisition will find this recording when they finish their work, when the quarantine becomes permanent, and the survivors of the Eternal Meridian are reduced to cautionary footnotes in classified archives. They will listen to my words and conclude what they have already concluded, that we are contaminated beyond redemption, that our existence poses unacceptable risk to imperial stability, that mercy takes the form of bolt rounds administered efficiently and without ceremony. They will be correct. What I must convey before that mercy arrives is not a plea for different treatment, but an explanation of what warp exposure does to human consciousness when exposure extends beyond the limits that Geller fields and navigator protection were designed to accommodate. What happens when the membrane between material and immaterial erodes not catastrophically but gradually, so slowly that you don't realize you're changing until the change is complete and irreversible? The Eternal Meridian was a heavy cruiser operating on the Korvax run, a stable warp route connecting 3 moderately important Forge worlds with the sector capital, a journey that should have required 6 weeks of warp travel across distances that in real space would have demanded centuries. I had served aboard the Meridian for 3 years as apprentice to Navigator Primary Castellan, learning the art of perceiving the warp's currents, of guiding vessels through the Immaterium's chaos, while maintaining the psychological discipline necessary to observe unreality without being consumed by it. The training is extensive, begins in childhood for those born to navigator houses, involves genetic modification and psychological conditioning and education in meditation techniques that create barriers between consciousness and the raw stuff of the warp that presses against those consciousness like ocean against glass. We are mutants, officially sanctioned, bred and trained to perform function that unmodified humans cannot survive. Our third eye, the mutation that allows warp perception, is both gift and curse, tool and vulnerability, the aperture through which we guide ships and through which the warp can observe us in turn if we're not careful. We entered the warp storm 3 weeks into what should have been routine transit. The storm appeared without warning, without the preliminary disturbances that proper warp weather monitoring should detect. Just suddenly the currents shifted, and we were inside something vast and turbulent and hungry. Castellan attempted immediate emergency translation back to real space, but the storm had already established some kind of grip on us, had created conditions where the boundary between material and immaterial became unclear, where attempting to force translation might tear the ship apart or strand us in whatever intermediate state exists between dimensions. He made the decision to ride it out, to maintain Geller field integrity and navigate toward calmer regions, to trust that the storm would pass or we would find exit vector, standard procedure, rational response. What we didn't understand, what no one could have understood without experience we were about to gain, was that some warp storms don't pass. Some represent stable features of Immaterium geography, permanent tempests that exist in spaces where the warp's nature becomes more concentrated, more intentional, more aware. I cannot describe the storm adequately. Words evolve to describe material phenomena fail when confronted with something that exists primarily as emotional and conceptual structure rather than physical architecture. Imagine drowning in feelings that aren't yours, in thoughts that form in your mind fully developed without precedent or causation, in sensations that bypass your nervous system to register directly in consciousness without physical stimulus. Now imagine that experience sustained not for seconds but for years, uninterrupted, constant, while you maintain navigational duties and ship operations, and the fiction that you're still the person you were before exposure began. The storm had texture, if texture can exist without tactile dimension. It had color, if color can exist without light. It had sound, if sound can exist without medium. My third eye perceived these qualities continuously, registered them in ways that my organic eyes and ears never could. Processed information that had no equivalent in material reality. The Geller field held That's what we told ourselves during those first weeks, as the storm showed no signs of diminishing, as navigation became exercise in finding least terrible vectors through chaos that seemed to actively resist our attempts at progress. The field generators maintained their rhythm, the blessed machinery hummed with machine spirits content in their function, the barrier between ship and storm remained intact. We monitored constantly, ran diagnostics hourly, watched for any fluctuation that might indicate impending failure. The readings showed green. All systems nominal. We were safe, contained, protected by technology the Mechanicus had perfected over millennia of warp travel, by understanding accumulated through countless voyages and failures and lessons purchased with destroyed vessels and lost crews. The field held. But what we didn't understand, what became clear only later, was that Geller fields protect against sudden catastrophic exposure, against the warp-breaching hull integrity and flooding interior spaces with raw chaos. They're not designed for sustained exposure to warp phenomena at concentrations we were experiencing. They're barriers, not filters. They keep the warp out, but they don't eliminate the pressure, don't reduce the intensity of what's pressing against them from outside. The dreams started after the first month, not nightmares. I wish they had been nightmares, wish they'd contained the specific terrors that nightmares provide, the concrete threats that consciousness can process and reject upon waking. These were something else. Experiences that occurred during sleep, but which felt more like memories, like I was recalling events that had happened to me in lives I'd never lived, in places that couldn't exist, in contexts that violated every understanding of how reality operates. I would wake convinced I had children whose names I knew but who had never existed. I would wake remembering conversations with people I'd never met about topics I'd never studied. I would wake carrying knowledge I shouldn't possess, understanding of processes and techniques and historical events that weren't part of my training or education. The dreams accumulated, left residue, began blurring the boundary between what I'd actually experienced and what I'd dreamed experiencing. I reported this during psychological evaluations that Navigator Primary Castellan conducted weekly, standard procedure for extended warp exposure. He listened, nodded, made notations, told me this was expected, was normal response to prolonged Immaterium proximity, that the dreams would fade once we emerged from the storm. He didn't mention that he was experiencing identical phenomena, that everyone aboard was experiencing it, that normal response had progressed beyond anything our training covered. The physical changes began subtly. Small things, easily dismissed as stress or fatigue or ordinary variation in human biology. My hair started growing faster, required cutting weekly rather than monthly. My fingernails developed ridges they'd never had, patterns that almost resembled text in some language I couldn't read. My vision improved, sharpened to the point where I could read text at distances that should have been beyond human visual acuity. My hearing became more sensitive, picked up conversations from neighboring compartments, detected frequencies at the edge of normal human range. These changes weren't limited to me. Crew members reported similar phenomena. Some developed enhanced sense of smell, could identify individuals by scent alone, could detect emotional states through chemical signals. Others found their reaction times improving, their physical coordination becoming almost preternatural, their bodies responding to threats before conscious mind registered danger. We catalogued these changes, documented them, told ourselves they were temporary adaptations, that human biology was flexible enough to respond to unusual environmental pressures, that we'd return to normal once we escaped the storm. By the 6th month we'd stopped believing we'd escaped the storm. Navigation had become impossible. The storm's interior showed no consistent structure, no reliable currents, no exit vectors that remained stable long enough to pursue. We were adrift, maintaining Geller field integrity and life support, conserving resources, waiting for something to change while acknowledging that nothing would change, that this was permanent, that the eternal meridian would remain trapped until systems failed, or crew died, or something external intervened. Ship's captain called assembly, addressed all hands via Vox system, explained situation with the blunt honesty of officer who'd realized that maintaining morale required truth rather than false hope. We were stuck. Rations would last approximately 5 years at current consumption rates. Water recycling was sustainable indefinitely barring system failures. Air quality was degrading slowly, carbon dioxide scrubbers operating at 83% efficiency and declining, but immediate crisis was unlikely. We could survive. We would survive. For some definition of survival that involved enduring rather than living, that measured success in continued biological function rather than any meaningful existence, the psychological changes were harder to categorize than the physical ones. I found myself thinking in patterns that felt foreign, reaching conclusions through reasoning processes I hadn't learned, understanding concepts that seemed to arrive fully formed without prerequisite knowledge. The change wasn't sudden enlightenment, nothing that dramatic, just gradual expansion of cognitive capacity, as if my brain was developing new structures or activating dormant capabilities or being modified in ways that enhanced function while fundamentally altering what function meant. I could visualize geometric relationships that previously required paper and calculation. I could hold multiple complex concepts in working memory simultaneously without confusion. I could perceive patterns in seemingly random data, recognize correlations that statistical analysis would have missed. These capabilities were useful, made navigational work easier despite the navigation's futility, made maintaining ship systems more efficient despite having nowhere to go. But the capabilities came with cost. The expanded cognition carried perspectives that weren't mine, worldviews that had developed in contexts I'd never experienced, value systems that contradicted everything I'd been taught. I found myself questioning the imperial truth, wondering whether the emperor's divinity was theological reality or political fiction, found myself doubting the necessity of the Imperium's brutality, suspecting that humanity's survival didn't require the scale of suffering the Imperium inflicted, that alternatives might exist that we'd never explored because exploration would undermine power structures dependent on maintaining current conditions. These thoughts were heresy. I recognized them as heresy. But recognizing heresy didn't make the thoughts less compelling, didn't restore certainty about propositions I'd previously accepted without examination. The warp was changing not just my capabilities but my values, not just my cognition but my identity, and I lacked framework for determining whether the changes represented corruption or evolution, contamination or enlightenment. Year 2 brought the voices. Not auditory hallucinations. I remained capable of distinguishing between sounds that existed in material reality and sensations that originated in consciousness. These were something between thought and speech, communications that arrived in my mind fully formed, that carried information in formats denser than language allows, that seemed to come from outside myself while also feeling native to my own thought processes. The voices weren't consistent entities, weren't individual personalities I could identify and track. They were more like fragments, pieces of consciousness that existed in the storm, that had been generated by or attracted to the intense warp concentration we occupied, that had begun interacting with human minds once exposure duration crossed some threshold. The fragments communicated in concepts rather than words, conveyed meanings that I had to translate into language after receiving them, that lost precision in translation because language hadn't evolved to carry the kinds of information the fragments contained. Most communications were incomprehensible or fragmentary, partial transmissions that lacked sufficient context to interpret. But some made sense. Some conveyed understandings about the warp's nature, about the relationship between material and immaterial reality, about consciousness and how it interfaces with both dimensions. I learned that the warp isn't purely chaotic, that it contains structures and regularities and something resembling natural laws, just laws that operate on principles alien to material physics. I learned that consciousness affects warp topology, that thoughts and emotions create actual topographical features in immaterial space, that the boundary between psychology and physics becomes meaningless in context where mental states have direct physical consequences. I learned that the Geller field protecting us was transparent from the warp side, that entities existing in immaterial space could perceive us clearly, could observe our thoughts and emotions, could interact with our minds through mechanisms that bypassed physical barriers because minds exist partially in warp space already, because consciousness is the interface between dimensions regardless of what protections your body might possess. Navigator Primary Castellan died in year 3, not from warp exposure or violence or any particular cause we could identify. He simply stopped functioning, collapsed during navigational watch, and by the time medical response reached the navigation blister, he was dead, his body showing no injury or disease or failure that explained the cessation. The ship's medici conducted examination, found nothing conclusive, filed report attributing death to accumulated exposure stress. They didn't mention that his third eye had changed, that the warp sight organ all navigators possess had begun developing additional structures in the weeks before his death, that his reports had described perceiving dimensions of the storm invisible to my less developed sight, that he'd been furthest along in whatever transformation we were all experiencing. I inherited his position, became navigator primary, not through qualification but through being only navigator remaining, only person aboard with genetic modification and training necessary to perceive the storm, even if perceiving it served no navigational purpose anymore. I moved into his quarters, read through his private logs, discovered notes describing his own transformation in detail I'd never recorded, his own attempts to understand what we were becoming. The logs revealed that Castellan had been communicating with something, not fragments or voices, but what he described as presence, entity, intelligence, existing in the storm that had taken interest in our ship, that had been observing us, studying us, learning from our exposure, the way we were learning from it. He'd named it the Witness, though he noted that names were probably meaningless for something that might not distinguish between itself and its environment, that might experience identity in ways that made the concept of individual selfhood irrelevant. The Witness had taught him, showed him things about warp navigation that conventional navigator training deliberately avoided, techniques that allowed for more direct interaction with immaterial space at cost of increased exposure risk. Castellan had been practicing these techniques, had been using the storm as education, had understood months before his death that we weren't going to escape, that our role was no longer navigation but observation, that something wanted us to experience this transformation and was facilitating it through means we couldn't comprehend, because comprehension required perspective we hadn't developed yet. I followed Castellan's example, started communicating with the Witness, started implementing the techniques his logs described, started approaching the storm not as obstacle to be overcome, but as environment to be understood. The shift in perspective was immediate and disorienting. When you stop trying to escape and start trying to comprehend, the storm reveals depths that resistance-oriented consciousness can't perceive. I saw structures, vast architectures that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously, that served purposes I couldn't determine but which clearly weren't random, weren't chaos, weren't the mindless tempest we'd been taught to fear. I saw entities, beings composed of warp stuff that moved through the storm with obvious intentionality, that noticed my observation and responded, that attempted communication in formats my mind struggled to process. I saw history, events that had occurred in this region of warp space, traces of previous ships that had entered the storm, remnants of consciousnesses that had been absorbed or transformed or destroyed by exposure that had exceeded their capacity to adapt. The crew was changing more rapidly by year 4. The physical modifications had become pronounced, undeniable, impossible to attribute to normal biological variation. Crew members' bodies had begun expressing adaptations that made sense only if their biology was responding to warp presence as if it were actual environment rather than abstract external phenomenon. Enhanced sensory capabilities, increased cognitive processing speed, metabolic changes that reduced nutritional requirements, improved efficiency of cellular processes, extended probable lifespan, regenerative capacity that allowed healing from injuries that should have been permanently debilitating. We were becoming something else. Something adapted to existing in proximity to warp energies, something that could interface with immaterial reality without immediate corruption or death. But the changes weren't purely beneficial. They came with costs that weren't immediately obvious, weren't physical degradation but alterations to fundamental aspects of human experience. Emotions became less stable, less predictable, subject to influences we couldn't identify or control. Memories became unreliable, mixing with the dream memories and the communications from warp fragments until distinguishing between experiences that had actually occurred and experiences that felt like they'd occurred became impossible. Identity became fluid. The sense of possessing continuous selfhood eroding as we realized that what we thought was individual consciousness was actually composite, porous, constantly being influenced by and influencing the consciousness of others around us and the warp presence surrounding us all. We were losing boundaries, merging in ways that weren't quite telepathy but weren't quite distinct individuality either, becoming something collective while retaining enough separation to experience the collective from individual perspectives that were themselves dissolving. Year 5 marked the breakdown of ship hierarchy, not through violence or mutiny but through simple irrelevance, through recognition that rank and command structure made sense only in context where individuals remained sufficiently distinct to be ordered, where authority could be enforced through systems that assumed stable identities and clear boundaries between self and other. We were beyond that now, operating through something closer to consensus, making decisions through processes that involved perspectives from everyone aboard without requiring formal deliberation, knowing what needed doing without discussion because the knowledge existed in shared cognitive space we all accessed continuously. Ship maintenance continued. Life support operated. Resource management remained functional. But the organizational structure dissolved, replaced by something more organic, more efficient, more aligned with what we'd become. The Inquisition found us in Year 7. A patrol vessel detected the Eternal Meridian's warp signature somehow, managed to establish brief contact, transmitted demands for identification and status report. We responded honestly, transmitted complete logs, explained everything that had occurred, described our transformation, requested either rescue or formal documentation of our condition for inquisitorial archives. The response took weeks to arrive, came not from the patrol vessel but from larger ship, properly equipped inquisitorial vessel with full quarantine capabilities. They established containment field around the Meridian, prevented any possibility of warp translation, transmitted formal notice that we were under investigation for suspected chaos corruption, that boarding parties would conduct examination and make determinations about our status. The boarding parties wore full environmental protection, entered the ship as if entering contaminated zone, as if our atmosphere itself carried infection. They examined us with instruments, took biological samples, conducted interviews recorded by equipment designed to detect mimetic hazards and psychological corruption. They asked questions about our experiences, our capabilities, our understanding of the warp and its nature. We answered honestly because deception was impossible. Because they'd recognize any lies immediately, because truth was our only possible defense, even though we knew truth would condemn us. The investigators listened, documented, withdrew to their ship to deliberate. The verdict arrived 17 days later. We were contaminated beyond acceptable limits. The transformation we'd undergone, while not traditional chaos corruption, represented exposure to warp phenomena that made us security risks, potential vectors for contamination of others, examples of what happens when human consciousness merges too thoroughly with immaterial reality. The Inquisition's judgment was that we could not be permitted to survive, that our condition was transmissible through means not fully understood, that allowing us to remain alive and potentially make contact with uncontaminated populations posed unacceptable risk to Imperial stability. They offered mercy, quick death, minimal suffering, no torture, no interrogation beyond what had already occurred, no attempts to extract information through methods the Inquisition typically employs. Just termination, performed efficiently, followed by complete sterilization of the Eternal Meridian and its reduction to component atoms. We accepted. Not because we lacked alternatives. By Year 7 we'd developed capabilities that might have allowed escape, might have permitted fighting the inquisitorial vessel, might have created possibilities our pre-transformation selves couldn't have imagined. We accepted because we understood they were correct. What we'd become wasn't chaos, corruption in the traditional sense, wasn't possession by demonic entities or worship of ruinous powers or active collaboration with forces seeking humanity's destruction, but it was transformation beyond what the Imperium could accommodate, beyond what human civilization could integrate, without risking fundamental changes to humanity's relationship with the warp, without opening doorways that the Imperium had spent millennia keeping sealed. We'd survived the warp storm. But we'd survived by becoming something that couldn't return to human society, something that existed in intermediate state between human and something else, something that would always carry trace of the storm, would always remember what we'd learned, would always be capable of spreading that knowledge to others who weren't ready for it. The truth behind Warp Storm survivors is this: survival is possible, but survival requires transformation. The human mind and body can adapt to sustained warp exposure if that exposure doesn't immediately destroy consciousness, can develop capabilities and understandings that allow functioning in immaterial environments, can become something that bridges material and immaterial reality. But that transformation is precisely what the Imperium exists to prevent, what all of humanity's safeguards against chaos are designed to stop, what every inquisitor and witch hunter and ecclesiarchy enforcer spends their life fighting against. Because transformation means losing boundaries, means accepting that the warp isn't purely enemy but environment, means understanding that consciousness and chaos aren't opposites but continuums, that the difference between sanctioned psyche and warp-touched abomination isn't categorical but gradual, that everyone who touches the Immaterium changes, and the only question is whether the change happens slowly enough to integrate or fast enough to terrify. We survivors of the Eternal Meridian changed slowly, spent 7 years transforming, developing, learning, becoming, long enough to maintain coherence, to remember who we'd been, to articulate what we'd become, long enough to recognize that we couldn't be allowed to exist, long enough to accept that mercy takes the form of bolt rounds administered efficiently and without ceremony. I record this testimony not as plea for reprieve, but as documentation, as final act of observation, performed by mind, trained to catalogue, even when cataloguing reveals truths that threaten the foundation upon which civilization rests. The Inquisition will arrive soon, will enter the ship with weapons ready, will terminate us one by one until no survivor remains, until nothing exists that carries memory of what prolonged warp exposure makes possible, what it costs, what it reveals about the nature of reality and consciousness, and the boundaries that separate self from environment. I am ready. We are ready. We have spent weeks preparing, not for resistance but for acceptance, for dying still recognizably human despite the changes, for proving through our cooperation that transformation doesn't necessarily equal corruption, that understanding doesn't necessarily mean damnation. The Inquisition won't believe us. They can't believe us, because believing us would require acknowledging truths that undermine imperial doctrine, that suggest the warp is more complex than enemy versus humanity binary, that consciousness exists in spectrum rather than categories. They will do their duty. We will accept our fate. And somewhere in classified archives this testimony will exist, will be studied by inquisitors trying to understand what warp storms do to survivors, what dangers emerge when humans adapt rather than dying, what the Imperium must guard against in its endless war against chaos. The voices from the storm continue even now. The witness observes, silent but present, offering no judgment about what's about to occur, simply existing as it has existed throughout, as it will exist after we're gone, as it existed long before we entered the storm. The warp doesn't care about individual fates, doesn't distinguish between life and death, except as states that consciousness occupies temporarily before transitioning to whatever comes next. We learn this, we understand this, and this understanding is why we must die, because understanding is contamination, because knowledge is corruption, because the Imperium survives through maintaining ignorance about realities that would shatter the certainties that keep humanity fighting when fighting is futile, that keep humans human when humanity itself is contingent category rather than eternal essence. I hear them at the airlock now. The boarding party. Here to administer mercy. I am not afraid. Fear is emotion that belongs to consciousness, that believes in discrete boundaries between self and universe, that imagines death as ending rather than transition. I gave up fear in year 3 when I realized I was already dying, already transforming, already becoming something that wouldn't survive regardless of whether my body continued functioning. The Selene Morda who boarded the Eternal Meridian died years ago in the storm, died so gradually she didn't notice until the death was complete, until looking back she realized no continuity existed between who she'd been and who she'd become. What remains is echo, memory, perspective that borrows her name while acknowledging the name refers to something that no longer exists in any meaningful sense. The door opens. Bolt weapons raised. Inquisitor speaking words about the Emperor's mercy and duty and the protection of humanity from abomination. Behind him I perceive not with my organic eyes but with sight that extends into warp space, perceive the Inquisitor's consciousness burning with certainty and faith and fear carefully denied, perceive his understanding that what he's about to do is murder but also necessity, perceive his acceptance that necessity sometimes requires killing people who haven't committed crimes, who haven't chosen corruption, who simply experienced something humanity isn't ready to accommodate. The bolt round enters my chest. I feel it not as pain but as interruption, as discontinuity in the biological processes maintaining my material form, as transition between states that I've been anticipating for weeks now with something between relief and curiosity about what comes after, about whether consciousness persists in some form or simply disperses into the warp like smoke into atmosphere. The testimony ends here. The recording captures these final moments, preserves them for archives that will classify this evidence at levels, ensuring minimal access, ensuring that truth remains contained, that knowledge stays quarantined, that humanity continues believing the lies necessary for survival, even when survival requires ignorance about what survival costs, what it demands, what it makes impossible. The storm continues, the witness observes, the warp doesn't care. And I, who was Selene Morda, dissolve into whatever comes next for consciousness that learned too much about realities the Imperium exists to deny, that transformed beyond redemption, that survived the warp storm, only to discover that survival and living are not synonymous, that what emerges from storms isn't always recognizable as what entered them, that the terrifying truth behind warp storm survivors is simply this: survival is possible, transformation is inevitable, and what transforms cannot return unchanged, cannot be permitted to exist where its existence threatens the fragile certainties that keep humanity human, in universe that offers infinite alternatives to humanity, each more terrible and more truthful than the lies we tell ourselves to keep fighting, keep surviving, keep pretending that what we are is fixed rather than fluid, essential rather than contingent, worth preserving rather than worth transcending if transcendence were possible without damnation. The bolt round completes its work, biology ceases, the recording ends. Truth remains, archived and classified and forgotten, like all truths too dangerous to acknowledge, too essential to ignore, existing in margins between knowledge and ignorance, where the Imperium stores everything that threatens while simultaneously protecting, everything that damns while simultaneously informing. Everything that reveals humanity's relationship with the warp is far more complex and far more terrible than doctrine admits, than faith allows, than survival permits acknowledging.